pressure, pushing down on me, pressing down on you, no man asked for. Under pressure, that burns a building down, splits a family in two, puts people on streets.
Welcome to MR Conversations. We're very glad you could join Michael D. Yates and Intan Suwandi tonight, possibly after a long day of work, possibly after a lifetime of work, as we discuss Yates's newest book, Work, 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 Labor, Alienation, and Class Struggle. In addition to being the editor of Monthly Review Press, Yates is the author of many well-known books on work and working people, from Can the Working Class Change the World?, which is now a tried and true classic assigned in classrooms across the decades, really now, to the ABCs of the economic crisis, what working people need to know, to naming the system, to why unions matter, and cheap motels and a hot plate. And while we're at it, I'll hold up Intan Suwandi's book, Value Chains. After Michael Yates speaks for a little while, Intan Suwandi will be his partner in conversation. One of the key things Yates and Suwandi have in common is that they work alongside workers and consider themselves workers. They don't merely research them, treating workers as objects of study. Let's start with the personal stake that you had in writing this book, as well as the many that came before, Michael. When you write a book titled Work, 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 and you're an economist who doesn't just write about workers, but from the vantage of workers, it makes sense to start by disclosing a bit about your relationship to work. And I'm certain that many of our viewers are curious to know a bit about Michael Yates, right? The editor of Monthly Review Press. So let's start, if you don't mind, Michael, with the first workers you ever met, the first world of work you ever encountered. So I'm going to start with the very beginning. What did your grandparents, mother and father, do for work, if you don't mind starting there?
Well, my mother worked when she was very young. She actually helped her brother and her mother unload dynamite at the face of a coal mine because miners bought their own used their own dynamite then. And she worked at the company store then for most of her adult life. She was a homemaker, raising us and taking care of my father, her mother, etc. My father worked in a glass factory for 44 years. His father, though self-educated, was the worst kind of person in a factory. He was a time study engineer. That is, he was a Frederick Taylor kind of person who actually time studied his own son once. And that must have been a little tough for my father. My maternal grandmother had a whole variety of jobs, working for the rich people as a governess, as a cook on a tugboat, sailing down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. And my paternal grandfather, who I never knew, he died before I was born. He was a coal miner and a glass worker. So that's my immediate family. Almost every member of my family was a working person of one kind or another. Truck drivers, coal miners, secretaries, clerical workers, etc. I joined the labor force when I was 12. I had a very large paper route that I had for 5 years, and I write in my book that I started out at 24 cents an hour. I found that unacceptable, and I confronted the owners of the newsstand and demanded a raise. So they raised my pay up to 36 cents an hour. So that was my first labor agitation. And I've had a whole variety of other jobs since. I spent most of my adult life as a teacher. I taught in colleges, and I taught in labor studies programs all over the United States, really. I had other jobs besides that. Now for a long time, I've been an editor at Monthly Review. So I've done that in one way or another for about 20 years now.
Michael, when Intan and I asked you who you wrote this book for, it was a pretty straightforward, clear, and rare answer. You said working people, and you said you wrote it for scholars that work as educators that work with working people. In other words, for all of us who are deeply impacted by neoclassical economics without fully understanding what it is or how it works and how it does its work on us. So could you tell us a little bit about the world of neoclassical economics and the language and the terminology that's used, and why you try to use it to take a different approach?
Let me preface that real quickly by saying that I wrote the book for working people, whether they're in the wage labor force or not, whether they're workers or peasants. For everyone who has spent a good part of their life having their bodies and souls stolen from them so a few people can be rich. That's who I wrote the book for. I studied economics in undergraduate and graduate school. I got a job teaching economics, and it didn't take very long to figure out that economists had nothing to say about the people who are, as the song said that started this meeting today, under pressure all the time, because the work's hard, because it's dangerous, because there's not enough pay to get the groceries and pay the bills, because you don't know if you're going to have the job for a very long time. You might lose it and what have you. They're under pressure. That's who I wrote the book for. And economists simply had nothing to say about that. You sold your labor, you got paid according to the economists. And as I point out in chapter 2, which is a review of Mary Filippo's fine documentary titled My Miseducation in 3 Graphics, you sold your labor, you got paid according to your productivity and whether you were lazy or not, essentially, depending on what your preferences were for leisure or for labor. And once that was done, that's the end of the story. And it just seemed to me, as I taught, as I met the other people around the campus, as I thought about the work I was doing, that just wasn't enough, that there was a lot more to the world, to economics than that. And that led to a pretty much complete and total rejection of neoclassical economics. And I learned it mostly by trial and error, by chance, by my own independent studies. And I found out a different way to think about work besides just the buying and selling of our capacity to work. The system is organized around the making of money, the accumulation of capital. That is, those who own the enterprises that we all need access to so that we can survive. Their goal is to make as much money as they can, and then to use that money to make their enterprises larger and larger and more powerful. And it starts out maybe locally, then it's regionally, then nationally, and of course now it's globally. It's all around the world, the same thing. Now the question is, how do they make that money? And what I learned was that they made that money from our labor. That is, our capacity to work is what generates the profit for them. Now we can get into the technicalities of that. I don't think that's really necessary at this point. But the long and short of it is that we need to be compelled to work a longer amount of time so that we generate the output, which when sold will not only pay our wages, but provide the capitalists with a surplus, to provide the owners with a surplus. When that surplus is sold, that's the profit. That's what it's all about. Now, if you think about that for a minute, if that money that makes the system tick, makes the world go round, so to speak, okay, if that money is to be made, then once the employer purchases our capacity to work, it's essential that we be controlled, because we're the only active element in the workplace. We're the only people that could cause trouble, that could put a monkey wrench in the wheels, so to speak, and prevent the profit from being made. So what Taylor understood that very well. And what he did was to systematize all of the control mechanisms that employers had already utilized and implemented. For example, one of the first things was they congregated workers inside of factories. And in those factories, they could watch the workers, and they could see that when the workers did their work, they often divided it up into subtasks or components. So why not assign different workers to do that and economize on the task labor, on the labor that took more training to do? And that then, of course, led immediately to the possibilities that you could mechanize some of the simpler tasks. And that mechanization gave the employer more control, because once the machines could be attached to an independent power source, then the workers could be controlled by the machines themselves. Taylor took those 3 things and he systematized them and developed his mechanism for deepening the control by gathering together, by watching and observing. That's what my grandfather did. the workers with a stopwatch. Now, you don't need that now. You got cameras and all kinds of impersonal ways to monitor the workers and see what kind of motions they make when they do their work and how long it takes to do those motions. Then you re-engineer them so that they can do them faster. And then you insist that they do it that fast. You give them a set of orders, like Taylor gave in his famous example of the worker Schmidt that unloaded pigs of iron off the railroad cars.
Michael, can you tell us what that example is for people who don't know real quick?
Well, Taylor got a job with the Cambria Iron Works, I believe, which is now Bethlehem Steel, or maybe it was Bethlehem Steel when he worked for them. I'm not sure. And I lived in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, and Bethlehem Steel was the big employer when I got there. And he wanted to speed up the unloading of the pickets of iron. They're molds of iron weighing anywhere between 50 and 100 pounds, probably. Unloading them off the car. Now, a typical worker could unload a certain amount. He got a guy, a Dutchman, I guess, named Schmidt, who was, as he understood it, close with $1. He wanted to make more money. And he told Schmidt, if you do exactly what I say when I say it, when I ring a bell, and stop when I tell you to stop, and you do that for the whole day. And it turned out that Schmidt did 4 times as much as the average, okay, by following Taylor's method. Well, then, of course, it's assumed that everybody can do that. Those that can't match Schmidt, they get fired. You pick other people to do it. So it's a speed up technique, essentially. And that's what scientific management is all about. It's no more scientific than it's just not scientific at all. Now, he tried to do that with machinists because he was trained as a machinist himself, Taylor. He couldn't do it with the machinists because their comprehension of the way work was done was and what they did was too complex to be like unloading pigs of iron. Now, of course, today, what are called numerically controlled machines, which were invented through military expenditures at the Air Force, if I'm not mistaken, you can program the cuts that a machinist makes as he takes a block of metal and converts it into a part. You can program that into a machine, and the machine will make those cuts for you. So it took a special kind of technology to defeat the capacities of the abilities of the machinists and wear them down. Taylor wasn't able to accomplish that. But the long and short of it is that everything that employers do is aimed at control of the workers so that when X amount of workers are used, you get Y amount of output. That's your goal, okay? Now, of course, the impact on the workers are not so good, but that's the long and short of what control is. And that's what I learned. Once you got the idea that it was our labor, our time that at work, that generates the profit that makes the whole system work, then the workers have to be controlled. And I used to tell my students when they all became business majors, I didn't have many economics majors anymore, I said the essence of management is control. And certainly that's true in a capitalist economy. Yeah, the essence of management is control. And that's one thing that I think workers need to know.
What's really helpful about a book like this is that you break down the mechanisms of control, and specifically you detail systematic hiring, team production, cross-training, just-in-time inventory, and Kaizen, if I pronounced that correctly. And I think Intan's book deals with a lot of this as well. So maybe this is an opportunity for Intan to jump in with some specifics around those different mechanisms of control as well.
Sure, thank you. That's an idea that I found very, very useful, right? When we read Harry Braverman and also, in Michael Yates' works, and I use Braverman in my own book. And I think this idea about emphasizing control mechanisms is very important. And I always also tell my students when I teach about labor and exploitation is that what your bosses bought from you was labor power, right? Now, after they bought that labor power, they have to make sure that they can transform it into labor. And to do that, there's a lot of control mechanisms at work. In my own study. I did field work in Indonesia. It's very interesting how control mechanisms were applied by employers. And speaking of Kaizen, right, that's something that was really emphasized in the factories that I observed, that they had to have this continuous improvement. And of course, that's a control mechanism. You have to improve, and this is how you do it. You have to increase your productivity and so on. And one of the interesting findings that I had about control mechanisms is when whenever there was a threat, right, of some kind of a strike. For example, if workers' income was threatened to be decreased, by some mechanisms, what employers, what the employers did, one of the things was that to change the production system in a way that, for example, they introduced an incentive system, right? So, okay, what to do so that workers are not upset that there's a possibility that their income will be reduced, for example, is to say, okay, we have a bonus system, we have an incentive system. And what you need to do is say to work in groups, and there are several criteria that you have to fulfill if you want to get bonuses. But this very criteria are the mechanisms of control themselves. So, for example, they have to make sure that the output that they produce was higher. But that's on the one hand, but on the other hand, they had to reduce any kind of error that happened. And this is when this machine aspect coming in as well, because they're dealing with machines, and they had to make sure that the output is higher. But say they have to, so it means that they have to increase the speed of the machine. But if you increase the speed of the machine, it's more likely that you do mistakes, right? So the burden is actually on the worker, how they have to manage this and create and still producing highly, and that way they can get the bonuses. But this is a control mechanism. The machine itself serves as a tool, right, to make sure that they can be controlled. And again, the burden is on them to balance how to produce, to increase production, but also to reduce error. So those are some of the examples. And that's a kind of like indirect means, right? But there were also direct means of control, of course. And there's this idea that that the supervisors should not lose sight of the factory floor, that they have to be there all the time, especially if there's any efforts to organize unions. They had to be very careful, right? They had to make sure that there are no intruders that can come in and start to organize. So those are some examples.
Mm-hmm. Michael, do you feel like ready to dive into some of the specific examples or some of the specific mechanisms of control that you outline in chapter 5?
Well, I think, there are so many of them. The one that we mentioned, the constant improvement, Kaizen, in auto plants, in the first chapter of the book, I have a review of the great book written some time ago called Rivethead. And it's by Ben Hamper, and it's about his labors as an auto worker. And at the time that he did that book, it would have been typical to be able to churn out about 40, to have to work about 45 seconds out of every minute, let's say, maybe a little less. So that it would be possible that you could spell your buddy across the assembly line. So you could learn each other's jobs, and then one person could do both of them. And he even got to the point where you could take a shift, half a shift. Your buddy could work half a shift and you could leave. You could clock out. You could have him clock out for you. And maybe you could head to a bar, maybe you could go home, whatever you wanted to do. But his last job was in one of the more modern lean production plants. It might have been a Japanese transplant, I'm not sure. And by that time, the work was up to 57 seconds a minute. That's what Kaizen does. It's constant improvement. Every fraction of a second matters. So for example, if you take an assembly line, the speed of the line, which is controlled by the management, might be sped up a little bit. And then the team is supposed to fix that problem. And there'd be a series of warning lights, and a warning light will turn yellow. You don't want it to turn red because that stops the line, but it'll turn yellow. And then the management, the supervisor comes down and says, get with it, we have to get that back to green again. And it's up to the team to solve the problem. And the teams are based upon the same kind of logic as the military. That is, they found out in the First World War, for example, that soldiers didn't like to kill one another, and they'd often fire their guns up in the air and try not to kill one another. So by the time World War II came around, the military devised a different way. One of the ways was to completely dehumanize the enemy. But the second way was to build on this idea of teams. That is, you fight to save your buddies. You don't fight for glory. You don't fight for democracy or anything like that. You fight to save your buddies. And if you ever see war movies, if you ever hear soldiers talk, that's exactly what they're talking about. Their buddy died. They do anything for their buddy. You hurt my buddies, and we're going to go into my My and we're going to murder a bunch of people because you killed my buddies. And team production works on that same kind of logic. That is, you try to build the kind of solidarity between the team members, so that when that light turns yellow, they'll figure out a way to get it to green again. Or maybe you stiff them a little bit on materials, a little bit less material. So they have to find a way to get the same work done with less material. So there are a variety of ways you can stress the workers. And that's why that song Under Pressure is so good, because you stress the system and you stress the workers, and the workers are expected to deal with the problem. And cross-training, of course, you get the idea that the workers are becoming multi-skilled, but they're basically learning subtasks, details. You learn to do a couple of details, and if one person is missing, if a team member is missing, or if the employer takes a team member away, then then one person has to do 2 subtasks instead of 3, instead of 1, let's say. So those are all ways that concretely stress the system. And of course, now you don't need Taylor's stopwatch. In a typical grocery store, for example, there may be 50 cameras or more. And there are a few dead zones in the store where the cameras aren't there. And if the workers learn those, then they can talk there and have a little bit of privacy. But you got no privacy. And now, of course, I think it was Joshua Sperber, the writer. He says that consumers are often the panopticon. They monitor the workers, like in hotels. Did your cleaning person do a good job? Who should we reward? Who should we punish? That kind of thing. So consumers themselves start to, they add pressure. Or a good one, since I was a teacher, student evaluations. Student evaluations could ruin a teacher's career. There's no question about that. And the students are considered customers now, and the customers have a right to evaluate you. And those evaluations then determine like how you prosper. It's especially bad for adjuncts, because one of the techniques of control is just in time. And just in time is usually thought of in terms of physical inventory. You keep that to a minimum, so that around an auto plant, there might be a specialty plant that makes steering wheels, and they're delivered to the main place just in time, where they're installed in the cars. That way you save space, you save money, et cetera. The workers in that sub plant will be paid less money, even if they're unionized, probably. Okay. But now you can do just in time with workers. You hire them just in time. Fast food restaurants will do that. They'll figure out where their busiest time was, and they'll beef up the workforce then, but not for the rest of the day. But just in time is especially applicable to adjunct teachers. You're hired just in time. If there's not enough students in your class in August, then you don't get to teach the class. So just in time can be applied in all kinds of ways. Now, not only to physical materials, but to workers themselves. So that's another technique. But one of the things I do want to mention, though, is we should never underestimate the control mechanism of force and violence and threat. That applies anytime the workers are attempting to form a union. In some parts of the world, that threat can include death. So that's a very important kind of mechanism. And what it helps to do, especially in the global South, is to generate such a tremendous amount of surplus that could actually help to fund the wages of some workers in the North. Not so much now as it used to. They used to talk about the aristocracy of labor. It can also, as John Smith pointed out in his great book about imperialism that Monthly Review Press published, it can also help to finance the state in the advanced capitalist countries. So it's kind of interesting that what Intan's talking about in Indonesia that she studied, those techniques are utilized in countries where the production is just as high as in the rich countries, and the mechanization is just the same. But the surplus is much, much greater because their wages are lower. Capital can move, workers cannot. They're stuck. And they're also under different kinds of pressure than workers in the rich countries are. Much more like, well, of course you could face it here too. So I don't want to understate that. There's all these control mechanisms. And then don't forget, there's also the control mechanisms that we have to realize that workforce is embedded in a larger society. And there are control mechanisms. What do you think schools are? Schools are control mechanisms. What do you think religion is to some extent? Control mechanism. What do you think the media is to some extent? What do you think the legal system is? What do you think the state is? They're all tied to that generation of money, that accumulation of capital. So one of their primary functions is to make sure that what doesn't work in the workplace will be taken care of outside of the workplace. So I don't want to. You could get too much in terms of those special techniques, and you can forget about some things that are also important.
Yes, if I may add, or emphasize Michael's point earlier about the global South. I mean, like the examples that I gave are from factories that supply to multinational corporations, right? So that's what's important about global production is that we think and people. Or scholars, some scholars argue this way that because the networks are decentralized, then power is also decentralized, that multinationals have no way really to control workers in the global South, but that's actually untrue. So all the control mechanisms that we talked about are actually, more or less directed by multinationals through their demands to their suppliers, right? So including just in time production, flexible production. So every time the suppliers are forced to change their production because of certain demands, also to kind of offset misforecasts, for example. Well, in the end, of course, the workers are the ones who have to deal with all of that, right? So it's really it's globalized, and the control mechanisms that factory management put onto their workers are influenced by what their multinational clients demanded. So they can't really get, they can really influence the process of control in the control of the labor process, right, towards the workers in the global South. And of course, we can also talk about the quota system. That's a control mechanism without direct kind of means, right? But if you have a quota system, then the workers have to produce certain things, a certain amount of things in certain amount of time that really put pressures for them. There are like plantation workers, for example, who work based on quota systems in the palm oil plantations, because their quota systems are so high, and it's really hard work. They cannot do it themselves. And sometimes they ask their sons, for example, to work with them, to help them, but the sons don't get wages, right? The sons were there just to help them, fill the quota. So what does that say about the wages? So those are some other examples that I can think of.
One other thing I wanted to say, which probably gets us off of this subject a little bit, because we're talking about control mechanisms in the workplace, but sometimes we could lose sight of what kind of work people actually do in the world. Just a couple of little things. There are 860 million farm workers in the world. Now think about that for a minute. One of my chapters talks about when I worked for the United Farm Workers, and it's a review of a book about the Farm Workers Union. Now, farm workers are the poorest of the poor in the United States. Their life expectancies today are not much higher than they were in the 1950s. There was a TV film written about farm workers, Harvest of Shame it was called. And the life expectancy of farm workers was about 50. And it's still not much higher than 50 in the United States. It's really awful kind of work. Well, now, if that's true in the United States, one can only imagine what it must be like in other parts of the world, in the global South, for example, where conditions are probably worse. So 860 million farm workers. There are at least 1.4 billion people doing what the International Labor Organization calls vulnerable employment, own account workers. Rickshaw drivers, people selling stuff on the street, the women in Bolivia getting scrap tin from big slag heaps, that sort of thing. We all know about that kind of work. Well, think about that. There's 1.4 billion people like that in the world. One that really always struck my attention, because I never knew what they were, but there's a type of cheap cigarette and cigar in India called bidis, B-I-D-I. And they're made from the cheap tobacco is wrapped in the leaves of an ebony tree that are dried. And in India, these are workers, women mainly, receiving very little money, being paid by the piece. And they're working in their homes or in sweatshops. And do you know that there are between 4 and 5 million people doing that in India? Think about that for a minute, 4 to 5 million people. And even if we were to look in the United States, we tend to think, well, jobs are cleaner now and they require more skill now, and they're not as dangerous as they used to be and what have you. They require mental more than physical labor. But, there are a whole lot of people working in factories in the United States. There are a lot of auto workers. There are a lot of postal workers. There are a lot of clerks. There are a lot of restaurant workers. They're in the millions and millions and millions. That kind of labor makes up at least half and probably more of all employment in the United States, in the richest country in the world. So all these control mechanisms are utilized in all different kinds of workplaces, that's for sure. And sometimes people that don't work in workplaces, you can get monitored while you're working at home. You can get monitored in all kinds of ways. You might be so desperate for money that you do whatever work you can get, these own account workers. I'm sure that rickshaw pullers are not monitored in the same way that the workers in factories are monitored, but they're going to be working awfully hard anyway. So I always want people to understand that the world of work is not a pleasant business for the most part. It is stressful. You are under pressure all the time. And I think that's important to know. I had what I think most people, when I did it for most of my career, things have changed in academia now, but it was considered to be a good job. Who would think that being a college professor wasn't a good job? You got automatic respect, you had some control over your workplace. When I continued to take on more and more students, never turned a student down from class, taught more and more classes, had take many preparations as they asked me, what was I doing? I was making the University of Pittsburgh be able to continue to grow, to continue to develop and grow, and so that the chancellor could make a lot of money, and so that the head of the medical school could make a lot of money, and so that the top star professors could make a lot of money. Well, that's exactly what I was doing. And when you think about it that way, you think, well, maybe one of the things I hope that my book will do will to get people to think about their own work, to think about what they're doing, to think about what might be done to make it better some way or other. I have a lot of things to say about that in the book, but that's what I hope people will, to sort of do a self-reflection, to try to ask yourself, wait a minute, what kind of work am I doing? Why am I doing it? For whom am I doing it? Et cetera, et cetera. And that's one of the things that I hope will happen.
William Corr says, I joined late and may have missed this, but I would like to hear Intan discuss how the working class in the US can most easily learn about and understand and unite with non-global core workers within common value chains.
Well, I mean, for me, because I'm a teacher, so I teach them, right? And fortunately, a lot of my students, as I said, are workers or they're from the working class. So this is actually a way for them to understand how they are connected to other people and in other parts of the world. We are all workers, and of course, we are all exploited, but they also understand that the fact that we can live like this is supported by the exploitation of workers in the global South. So there's a way, as a teacher, that's how I understand it. But I also just want to point out that a lot of Indonesian activists, including some people I know, are very keen about this, making, say, Marxism accessible to workers. So some people I know, they have some programs like through reading groups or through YouTube. They try to make these theories accessible so workers can understand these theories, because it is true. I mean, you need a theoretical framework, as Michael said as well, to make sense of exploitation, for example.
And someone suggested that we can't have education be top down. And I think we've both sort of been addressing that is when you teach, like, it'd be pretty obvious that I knew more about economics in general than my students did. I might know a lot more about a lot of things than my students, but on the other hand, they would know a lot more about certain things than I know. So the idea is to go from where the students are and have a discussion, a give and take kind of thing, where you learn from one another, but you're working towards the same goal. And that's what I think is the best kind of education.
Just curious about your thoughts on that, Intan.
Sure. And by the way, I mean, personally, I learned how to write well from monthly review authors, including Michael Yates and, John Foster. I found it amazing that they could explain, complex theoretical ideas, like in such a simple but not simplistic, right, ways. Every time I teach exploitation, so Marxist theory of exploitation, I use a chapter from Michael's book, Can the Working Class Change the World? And that is very accessible for my students. And of course, next semester, I'm going to use this new book, Work. But this is also related to somebody's question about, how do you familiarize, or how do you teach about, say, global South workers or unequal development to global North workers, right? A lot of my students are actually workers. They work, they have work, for many years. They work sometimes 2 jobs while going to school. And, in my experience, I think Michael mentioned this already as well, that when we teach something like exploitation, right? And you mentioned this also, Rebecca, they've known it, right? They've known that really deep inside, they know what exploitation is. But once you help them understand the concept through this theoretical framework, you can just see that something lit up in their heads, right? Oh, yeah, this is what's going on now. It all makes sense, that what exploitation is, what is surplus value, and what is being taken away from you. And something like this, theoretical things, political economy in general, it's sometimes people think of it as something very complex, something hard, but it's not supposed to be hard, right? It's supposed to be related to people's daily experiences. And once you can connect these theories to their lives, then it just flows. So that's how I do it. I make sure that it is related to their lives, it is related to their understanding of the world. And I teach development, I teach about global labor, about global labor exploitation, global labor arbitrage. And this is also a way a lot of my students express that, wow, I didn't know about all these things. Global labor arbitrage is basically replacing labor with higher wages with labor with lower wages, right? So on the global scale, this happens because what we call imperfect market. And I think Michael talked about this already, but basically on the one hand, capital, say from multinationals, they are relatively free moving around the globe, right, through investments, subcontracting, and so on. But on the other hand, labor is still confined within national borders. They're not as free as capital moving around. So this kind of wage differentials are being, the capital is taking advantage of this differences. And of course, Samir Amin says that when we talk about unequal exchange, we talk about how these differences in wages are greater than differences in productivity. So not only that wages are lower in the global south, but productivity is not that different, right? So because when we talk about exploitation, it's not only about wages, but also about productivity. So on the global level, that's what leads to higher exploitation in the global south. So that's global labor arbitrage. In terms of neoclassical economics, I often tell my sociology students, right, because in sociology we're usually critical of economics, but we don't really learn economics. So I always tell them, don't be scared, right? We have to learn some of this, and we have to learn how to challenge, mainstream neoclassical views if we want. But if we want to be able to criticize that, then we have to learn it a little bit. So yeah, I'm a sociologist who had to know about economics, right, to dismantle the mainstream narratives. And they of course understand that they are exploited themselves, but as Michael said earlier, when we talk about global south workers, then it's another level, right, of exploitative relations. And I always show them concrete cases. I emphasize that this is about human lives. I'm not going to show poverty porn or something like that, but I'm just emphasizing that this is happening, right? This is real. And we talk about all these macro level processes. We talk about capital, how they flow, and we talk about structural adjustment policies. But all of these things have concrete consequences for these workers, for these peasants, for this, people in the urban slums in the global South. And all of us are connected through, for example, commodities, right? Through our phones, through our shirts. Vijay Prashad wrote recently that, this is, it's based on Marx's commodity fetishism, but like, there are children, right, somewhere mining or making, or women exploited making your shirt, in all the commodities that we use, and a lot of times that exploitation disappears in these commodities, and that is why, if you want to be aware of these things, you really have to understand everything is connected to us. These are the things, these are connected to our lives of the stuff that we use.
Especially for working people that don't find themselves in college, whether because they don't have access to affordable education where they live, or they think of college as a debt racket, or they don't have the necessary time in between work and family obligations. How can working people learn about these things that you kind of outline in your book on their own? I'm not sure I have an answer to this. So I don't know if you do, but I'm curious to start thinking about that together.
Well, Leo Huberman, one of the founders of Monthly Review, was a real genius at this. He was a labor educator. I never met him, but he's one of the people that I always looked up to and tried to model myself after as I did worker education. You have to find ways to reach working people. There are entities that could reach them. The question is reaching them. The organized labor movement has done a really bad job, and they have the resources. They could do it. We see a big upsurge in union organizing right now. I mean, what was it, 500 Starbucks stores, a petition to get a union, and that well-known example of that Amazon warehouse in Staten Island, the Amazon Labor Union, which, by the way, Monthly Review sent them some of the book. So that's good. But it seems to me that one of the big weaknesses in labor organizing, political organizing, is they're almost always missing an education component. That is to say, in some unions, they'll teach people how to file grievances and things like that, but they don't teach them about the nature of the system itself or about the nature of the work that they do. Now, I was real lucky because around 1980, I got my first work as a labor educator, and it was through the Pennsylvania State University in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. And working people would take a class once a week, usually on Wednesdays, a 3-hour class. A lot of times we'd meet in a union hall. And I would teach I taught a variety of subjects there. And that was a way to directly reach working people. Now that was through a university. It wasn't through the United Steelworkers Union, which was the biggest union in town. They didn't do that kind of thing. Very few unions do that kind of thing. Almost none, in fact, do the kind of systematic education that would allow workers to have a full grasp of things. Now, it's true that work itself will lead you to some consciousness, probably. And forming a union will lead you to some form of consciousness, okay? But it won't lead you to a complete consciousness, not typically. That requires more. That requires a more systematic study of things. Now, some workers will have the initiative to do that themselves, but there are like worker centers now where it's not directly affiliated with the union. They're all around the country. There were places where there are farm workers, for example, where there are meat packing workers, all different kinds of workers. And these worker centers do a variety of things. You know, they might teach workers how to speak English in the United States if they don't speak English to begin with. They might teach them how to navigate the immigration system, getting green cards and that sort of thing. But they also might help them with organization. And there's a great advantages to these worker centers because, for one thing, they're not bound by the labor laws the same way that a labor union is. And they can do certain things that a labor union can't legally do. And these would be excellent grounds for that kind of education to occur. Because because education has to occur through some sort of entity. Now, there used to be worker schools in the United States. And if I'm not mistaken, in Minneapolis, St. Paul area, they took one of these, it was the Brookwood Labor College, I think it was called. And they got a new Brookwood Labor College there now. And a guy I know who he's a college teacher, he's worked with community people and labor people to organize a new college where you offer classes to workers and that sort of thing. So there are lots of different possibilities. One of the problems is that I used to beg people on the left to try to get involved in these labor education programs. Now a lot of them have been canned, and there's a lot of pressure on them from businesses to end them. And no one ever took me up on that. I mean, no one. They had the opportunity to do it, they had the time to do it, but they didn't do it. And I think that's a big weakness. So that as this Amazon labor union, for example, organizes, okay, now they got a library and they've organized and they've gotten a lot of support. I'm sure they probably raised some funds. Then I don't know if they have it or not, but they have to have an education component that could reach out not only to their members, but to all kinds of workers that are being organized. So if indeed there is a big push for organization of workers now, in unions organized around their workplace, and who knows for what else. But even in things like where you have, say, community, like in Detroit, Grace Boggs started this organization where poor kids would learn how to grow food. And they got empty plots of land, they started farming it, and then you can have kitchens, you can have restaurants, you can have a whole pile of things like that. An education component is essential there because you can always tie that into the nature of the system and the extraction of surplus labor, because everybody's done work, one kind or another. So I think education components are, now maybe it's because I was an educator, maybe I'm full of baloney, but it seems to me that an education is important. The great historian Peter Linebaugh, he's done a lot of work on the commons, the land that was common to people. There's still a lot of common land in the world, and he talks about commoning, and he says commoning has to be taught all the time. It has to be reinforced all the time. And what he's talking about, of course, is education. So you take people's experiences and you build on them to deepen their knowledge. Another person asked the question, how do you keep labor unions pure? Well, that's a tough thing to do. Some unions have done it. But if you read that chapter I wrote about the United Farm Workers, you'll see what a difficult thing that is to do in a union that had so much promise and falls apart internally, as well as being attacked from the outside, because you got to expect that. That's always going to happen. So that's not an easy task. I have a good example of the Building Construction Workers Union in Australia. A guy named Jack Mundy. It was published in MR Online too, I believe. And if you read that, you get some really good ideas about how a good union could work and how it could be made to keep on working well. The United Electrical Workers is a pretty good union in the United States, and I'm sure there are several around the world. Somebody else asked, do people in the global north, do they really understand about imperialism? And my guess is that a lot of people don't really understand what imperialism is. I mean, you actually have great scholars who don't think money's flowing from the global south to the global north anymore. I don't mention any names, but you can read about it if you follow that sort of argument. And that seems like the most preposterous thing I've ever heard, that money's not flowing from the global south to the global north anymore. Of course it is. Now, as far as having solidarity, global south and global north, that's a really difficult thing to do, I think, because now, is it, did you say it was Samir Amin that says that the exploitation is being leveled out downwards so that workers in the global north are becoming more exploited? Maybe that's so. But if you see what the average wage is like, say, for a worker in Pakistan and what it is in the United States, it's a lot different. And what do they have in common with us? It's our duty in the global north to support those workers in the global south in whatever ways we can, and peasants, whatever ways we can. That's our duty to do that. That's how we would build solidarity. They're going to have to develop things themselves. For example, all of the Sikh farmers in India that had encampments around Delhi for over a year. Many of them died. They suffered all kind of repression from the police, but they actually won. The government had to give up on some of the anti-peasant laws that they wanted to pass. Now, if they could do that for an entire year, then they deserve our support. We should look to them for leadership instead of them looking to us for leadership. So it's the same thing in workplaces, where there's a tremendous amount of patriarchy and a tremendous amount of racism in all elements of society. We can offer our solidarity, as I can as a white man. I can offer my solidarity, but I mean, I can't be the leader of a lot of kinds of organizations. That's for other people to do now, I think. Definitely, you can't impose, you can't operate from above, think you're superior to people. So it's tough. It's tough to have solidarity across men and women. It's hard to have solidarity among Black workers and white workers, or brown workers, or red workers, or whoever. That's hard to do. Much less have solidarity with working people in China or India or Indonesia. That's hard to do. It's not impossible, but it's a difficult thing to do. So I don't want to give anybody any false impressions. It's just because we're all workers, we're going to have solidarity. That's not true here, for the love of Pete. Right. So why would it be true between rich and poor countries? It's just not going to be. It has to be worked at.
Somebody also asked a question about wage and productivity. So Samir Amin is the one who kind of emphasizes, right, that about this unequal exchange. So the differences in wages, say between global north and global south, are larger than differences in productivities. So even if there is a difference in productivity, it's not that much. I mean, in production, the global south is also very productive. Workers in the global south are very productive. So I just want to clarify that in relation to some questions there. And, my work on unit labor costs actually confirmed that. Right, that there's a measurement that combines both wage and productivity. And if you see the measurement, there's a large gap between countries in the global north and the global south. So in relation to especially the second question about remote work, of course, that's very important, right? So this is not only about, no longer only about manufacturing, for example, but also about this kind of work. Companies, because they are able to do this, they hire, say, customer service, IT personnel in other countries like India, for example. So a lot of times they are contractual, and of course they are paid lower, right, than workers here. So this kind of system becomes more and more available to other sectors, not only manufacturing. It's just that my previous study has been focusing on manufacturing. So yeah, that's another type of this global production. I don't know if that answers the question. What do you think, Michael?
I think it's going to say organize remote workers. Well, of course, you could still strike. You could refuse to do the work. You could do that from home. But the question is, how do you build solidarity with other people that do the work if you don't see them, if you don't meet with them in workplaces? I mean, work is always a social, I mean, it used to be anyway, a socializing experience. And if that's not the case anymore, then that obviously would present certain difficulties in terms of organizing. And that's maybe where you would need to have different kinds of organizations, like those worker centers that I was mentioning. That would certainly be possible, it seems to me, in, say, a city or a town, to have a workers' organization just for remote workers. That is to say that this would be a place, a neutral kind of ground where people could come together, if only at the beginning, to discuss their issues at work and to try to build up some ways that they could collectively deal with so that they could collectively deal with problems that they face, because they're still monitored, of course. I've heard people complain about endless Zoom meetings, one after another. And of course, the employers can monitor you. They got programs that they can make sure that are in your computer, your work computer, that they could monitor what you're doing. They could observe you in your home. So it's not so much the problem for employers, I don't suppose. And plus that, some employers are saying they're saving on office space now. They don't have to rent office space. People can work at home. They don't have to have, workers then have to pay for their own. No, they don't have to pay transportation to go to work anymore, but they may have to pay for other things that the employer might have paid for before. So you don't have to have lunch programs or anything like that for your workers, like some of the fancier tech places would have for their workers. Various kinds of amenities. They've made them work long hours, but they'd have certain amenities. Well, they need to have those anymore if they work from home. So you would probably need a different kind of organization. You'd have to have one that transcends individual workplaces and is more general, so that all of the workers that did a certain kind of work, like remote work in general, at least to start with. Now, certain kinds of remote work might be different from others, and maybe you need to have organizations for specific kinds of remote work. But probably new forms of organization will have to match the fact that more and more people are going to be working remotely. I don't think there's any question about that. That probably is going to require that. That's one suggestion. I'm sure, though, that the people that do that work will have ideas of their own. They'll have ways that if they're going to feel stressed, because they're going to be workers, whether they're working from home or not, they're going to be stressed, and maybe they're stressed even more. Intan, you would know because you had to do it, but remote teaching was, I don't think I could have done that. It just seemed like an overwhelmingly horrible thing to have to do. Now, there were some teachers that said they preferred it, but I don't think very many. So
I'm really bad at it.
you're gonna have, if all teaching was remote, then probably people should refuse to do that kind of work. But if you have to work, you got no choice in the matter, then probably the people themselves that do the work will have to figure out ways to get to meet one way or another. They could meet virtually too, for that matter, just outside of the employer's purview. So that's the way I would answer. That's one of the ways I think I would answer that question that was asked.
And Michael, in relation to your chapter about work is hell, right? And how work really is bad for us, for our mental health, and then if you think about this work from home, online work, you can also apply that, to the whole new level as well, like how that affects our well-being, I suppose.
Just real briefly, the root of the word work in European languages connote the notions of compulsion, torment, affliction, and persecution. Now, if we want to think about it, labor is a normal and necessary human activity. This is how we use the world around us to make the things that we need in order to survive. Now, we need to find ways to make the things that we need to survive cooperatively and collectively, so that there is no compulsion, torment, affliction, and persecution. That should be our end goal. Getting more in the workplace that we have is a good thing. I would never say it wasn't. But that's the larger thought that we need to think about. We need to make things necessary for life in such a way that there aren't any of these things. And so, since we haven't mentioned that yet, we live in harmony with the natural world around us. That's absolutely critical. And I guess I would just end up there. I have some examples in the book where people have tried to do that, and you can look at those, but I thought I wanted to say what the word work connotes. Nothing good.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael, for writing this book. It really is quite a resource to educators and to working people. Thank you, Intan, for your work developing these ideas in value chains, and for joining us all together today, all the people who came to hear us, to hear Michael speak and to hear Intan speak. And we hope to see you next time.
Yes, you too.
And thank everybody for attending, for coming.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for coming. And thank you, as I said in the chat, thank you for the work that you're all doing in your own communities or you've done in the past. If you're tired, it's okay to take a break now and then. But thank you for continuing the work if you're continuing the work as well.
Pressure pushing down on me, pressing down on you, no man asked for. Under pressure that burns a building down, splits a family in two, puts people on streets. That's okay.
It's the terror of knowing what the world is about. Watching some good friends screaming, let me out. Pray tomorrow gets me higher. Pressure on people, people on streets.
Okay. Chipping around, kick my brains round the floor. These are the days it never rains, but it pours. Dee-da-da-da, ee-dee-da-ba-ba, dee-da-da, better. People on streets. Da-da-dee-da-day. People on the streets. Da-da-dee-da-dee-da-dee-da.
It's the terror of knowing what the world is about. Watching some good friends screaming, let me out. Pray tomorrow gets me higher, higher, higher. Turned away from it all like a blind man. I sat on the fence, but it don't work. Keep coming up with love, but it's so slashed and torn. Why?